Hey, thank you so much. Thank you so much. So we've got a fantastic panel of super experienced cyber professionals. So we've got Chris Cleary, George Franz, and Montgomery. And I'll let them introduce themselves. So what we want to do is look a little bit at the history of cyber forces. We want to look at kind of what are some arguments for and against having separate cyber forces, and maybe where we cut the deck, and what does the future hold? What are some other models besides cyber forces? We've got the SOCOM model. What relationship might we have with the National Security Agency going forward? So there's a whole host of different things we could talk about, but we'll start with history. So Chris, if you don't mind, and then just a quick introduction, some thoughts on history, we'll go down the line.
Thank you. So Chris Cleary, for those of you who don't know me, I'm currently the Principal Cyber Advisor for the Department of the Navy. I just want to caveat, as the only person on the stage who's actually in an official position right now, a lot of these thoughts are my own thoughts. These are not the reflection of the Department of the Navy or the Secretary of the Navy, so I stay out of trouble if I go down some dark territory, which I'm likely to. I've been associated with the cyber community in one way, shape, or form since it got founded. And I guess we can call 2010, as we heard the historians say earlier today, kind of that snapping of the chalk line. We'll call that the creation of the cyber community when the establishment of U.S. Cybercom, just for a placeholder. As somebody who does a lot with the resourcing of the mission force, from the Navy's and the Marine Corps' responsibility for provide forces to U.S. Cybercom, I certainly, and the Navy has some strong opinions on what that means as a service provider to a Joint Force commander. And then, yeah, it's an interesting debate. There are strong opinions on both sides of this, both in and outside of the department, of whether we should consider a cyber force, or maybe to one degree, a cyber service, or have a service be the executive agent for the resourcing and providing cyber forces to the Joint Force commander. And I'm interested to kick this off. This is going to be fun.
All right. Working okay? There we go. So I'm George Franz. As the bio says, I'm a Major General in the U.S. Army, retired. A little bit history. So my first, I would say, professional experience in the information ops domain was 1996, when I wrote one of my SAMS monographs on information operations, and got really, Intel officer background, so I had done signals intelligence. That was the first time I really started thinking about information operations, and cyber wasn't cyber yet. It wasn't a domain, but computer network operations and all those things were occurring. Since my experiences that will inform obviously my assessment opinions here. So in 2006, as the brigade commander of the Army SIGINT Brigade at Fort Meade, 704th, and my brigade, General Alexander called me into his office. He was, I think, still the J2 at CENTCOM, knew he was coming in and he said, hey, we need the Army to create a cyber battalion. And so John Davis, who was then the first IO commander, and myself, we had that task to stand up the Army. And so in 2008, we flagged the Army Network Warfare Battalion, which was the Army's first dedicated cyber operations force. Following that, a number of assignments kind of between operations and cyber. So I was the Deputy J3 at U.S. Cyber Command, where we created the CMF, created the CIFCO. That was the time when we actually created the force presentation model, the first written doctrine for defense DoD cyberspace operations. Joint Pub 312 was being written. We worked that. I was the first commander of the Cyber National Mission Force, the best job, which I wish I could have kept. Unfortunately, I went from there to command Army INSCOM, so the Army Intelligence and Security Command, which is, again, a much more mature two-star command, where I had responsibilities for the ADCON of 780th on other cyber things, so stayed in the fight, and then came back to Cyber Command as the J3. I've been retired from active duty for about 5.5 years. I work at Accenture Federal Services, which is just Google it. It's a behemoth of an IT tech company, and I've spent my last 5 years, again, supporting the Department of Defense and IC with the things that Accenture does as a industry guy. So, and these, again, my opinions are my own. I don't have an official position either, but I've got a lot of opinions.
Next, Mark Montgomery. I'm a retired Navy Rear Admiral, not cyber. I commanded ships and destroyers and carrier strike groups and things like that. My experience in cyber is DJ5 and the J5 at UCOM and the J3 at Baycom. In both those places, I had to deal with Cyber Command's evolving idea of what CMFs and what the CPTs and CMTs would look like. And I was there when we cut the deal. I was on the Navy staff when we cut the deck on how many people we would give to Cyber Command back in 2010, 2011. I'll say that me, along with all my combat arms brethren, I think it was Punch Bolton and General Breedlove in the Air Force, we worked very hard to minimize the number of people we had to give to the Cyber Mission Force, and we were successful. I think we made it 6,200. I think the real number is 5,800. But, you know, I will just tell you, the combatant armed, I'm very consistent with all my other combatant arms brethren, which is let's see if we can do cyber with the minimal effort and continue to stock up battalions, ships, and squadrons. And unfortunately, I don't think that's changed in the last 12 years, but we'll get into that debate.
Hey, super way to lead off. Is the mic working? Okay. So some of these mics are not advanced and persistent, so they were going on and off. But hey, I was here at HammerCon last year, and I gave a talk. CIC is back, the College of Information and Cyberspace is back, but for how long? It's on YouTube. You can watch it later. But what's that? yeah. But there was a talk just this morning about the Air Force Cyber College postmortem. And so one of the questions is, you know, can cyber persist? Would we have the air doctrine we had now if it was still the Army Air Corps? Right, that's a question. So let's start with, what are the arguments against a separate cyber force?
All right, I'll start very quickly, because the fundamental arguments where it comes down right now is that the services have the capability, maybe not the capacity, but the capability to present forces as required by US Cybercom. All the services have stood up variants of cyber career paths, the Navy being the last one that will be coming out imminently with the Maritime Cyber Warfare Officer and the Cyber Warfare Technician. So both officer and enlisted ratings that are coming out imminent. You'll see them in maybe by the end of this year, or definitely into 2024. So that's new for us. All the other services have created cyber paths, have cyber training. We have, you know, the 1,000 level trainings that the services are providing right now. We have the 2,000 level trainings that will be provided by US Cybercom. As you heard earlier from Holly, you know, the enhanced budget control, the additional authorities that US Cybercom has created, and you know, the belief would be all the pieces are in place that would enable the full resourcing and providing of capability to US Cybercom. So I think that's, for the most part, the argument against. And then you get into the other arguments against, which just gets into it's a zero-sum game. If you stand this force up, somebody will lose. Somebody's going to lose resources. Somebody's going to lose bodies. Somebody's going to lose money, which I think that's real fundamentally where most of the argument kind of comes in from. We saw what happened in the creation of Space Force. You know, the pain that caused in the initial years, whether it's going to have a positive outcome in the out years is still, I think, to be determined. And maybe the scars from the services over having standing up a Space Force, not wanting to really tackle the idea of standing up a cyber force or a cyber service right now.
Yeah, so I'll continue. Thanks, Chris. So again, kind of to reframe it, and then teach you in general officer speaking course, answer the question you want to answer, not the question you were asked. But I'm waiting for the question. I think some fundamental principles, really, regardless of what we do with the discussion, and I hope it stays a, you know, an adult, like a fact-based discussion, and doesn't get into a religious debate, not here with my colleagues, but out there. Ultimately, one, the focus has got to be on improving the operational readiness of the cyber force to conduct joint all-domain operations, period. That's got to be the absolute requirement that we're fulfilling. I think it's got to fulfill this notion of a sense of urgency. We know 2027, 2030, we have got to be ready for major combat operations, and we heard Representative Gallagher say today 2 years, so that's even a quicker time. So it's got to be, whatever we do, it's got to make us more ready, and it's got to do it with a sense of urgency that does not disrupt current operations. I think, as Chris said, we've got to apply the finite resources, which is time, people, money, and energy. We've got to apply those to solving the problems that need to be solved to do the above two things. What I would posture is Cybercom and the joint community, DoD and others, have worked hard to get Cybercom in a position now, starting in FY24, where they can solve actually meet a lot of the challenges that had been the fuel for the debate about a cyber force. acquisition authority for JICWA, Cybercom, enhanced budget authority at Cyber Command, service-like training authorities at Cyber Command, a sub-unified cyber national mission force that's role is getting defined, and that's a capability for that national mission. New doctrine for expeditionary cyber that ties the cyber enterprise from strategic to operational to tactical, which has to be done. You've got the transition of Cyber Command from Air Force as an executive agent to Army as the command support agency. And I would submit, again, I'll be a little parochial, the Army's been well invested in cyber and has done things above and beyond what they were asked for the joint force. So again, my personal opinion is they're not a disparagement of the Air Force, but as a former Army officer involved in this, I see that move as being very positive in terms of the support Cybercom will get, not just from the service, but also Fort Meade and other things that had impacts. The other thing that we cannot understate is the improved operational effectiveness and relationship between Cyber Command, the National Security Agency, and the partnerships that they have built to conduct operations that you heard about this morning. Do not underestimate the need, not only to improve, to maintain that effectiveness of the dual hat command and control relationship, but to improve it. And then lastly, the Cyber Command, after Chris and I have gone through probably 20 years of staff assessments and studies. Well, how big should the Cyber Command staff be? And it was always understaffed and under-resourced. They're just at the verge now of actually getting the authorizations and the people to do the functions, the AdCom functions, acquisition, resourcing, that the command has always needed to do and was never staffed to do it. And I think if you stack up those 8 things and apply them against urgency and operational focus, I think that we need to devote every bit of our resource and energy to achieving those ends now and not distract from that focus.
But obviously, I don't think there are strong arguments against Cyber Force. In fact, I'm going to say, George, that was a perfect argument for a strong Cyber Command. No one disagrees with that. The problem is we're conflating Cyber Command and Cyber Force. Cyber Command employs the operational elements. They do the work with NSA. They do the partner and ally, the building, the generational forces. And they should continue to do that. What I'm talking about is who should do the force generation. By the way, the last thing I want to do is saddle Paul Nakasoni's relief with being the force employer, the dual hat with NSA, and the force generator. And the only solutions besides having a separate cyber force is to make Cyber Command the force generator to get that level of consistency across the services. And I do think that's too much. So I would say, you know, huzzah and everything you said about Cyber Command, I'm right with you. I will note that most of the advantages you've mentioned in acquisition and budget were actually imposed on the Department of Defense by Congress, which tells you that leaving this to the Department of Defense to, quote, make a good cyber, you know, a force generation model has not worked. And to Chris's point, the only reason the Navy's unscrewed itself is after multiple orders from Congress, they were finally just explicitly ordered to do exactly this. So I'm going to say point blank, the Department of Defense has mismanaged this for a decade. Any idea of the sense of urgency we have is because 12 years of doing something and not getting the right result and then doing it again the next year has left us in the position where we're only now getting to that cusp. So I think a cyber force, and we'll talk about the value about how you get to that, is going to solve these problems and make everything you said more true, which is Cyber Command will be a better force employer because they have a better force generator.
All right, well, we have assembled a panel with differing opinions, which is all to the better. And hey, I did not give my disclaimer. I'm not speaking for anybody except Joseph Schafer. But I will point out that it was the Department of Defense that elected to get rid of the Air Force Cyber College and the College of Information and Cyberspace. Congress stepped in and said, we created the College of Information and Cyberspace, and thou shalt not get rid of it without our approval.
And fenced a whole bunch of your money.
And
to prevent you
all our money.
Yeah.
When our new president came in, he spent a lot of time trying to answer Congress before he could do anything else. So Congress cares, right? That's one of the things. So another thing that's super clear among the discussion we just had, as well as all the sessions this morning, is we have made a lot of progress in the last 50 years. Thank you, Jay Healy. So we've made a ton of progress in our cyber services as well. So let's switch and see if our panel can come up with any good ideas for why we should have a cyber service, a separate. We'll talk nuances later, but let's see what the arguments might be for having a separate cyber service. Go ahead.
Mark, I'll go ahead. Look, I do believe in this. Look, if I could wind back time, I'd convince, the last vice president that he needs to create a cyber force and not a space force, and we haven't. Because the only reason we have a space force right now is Vice President Pence said we're going to have a space force, period, full stop. He had the support of Mike Rogers, who was the ranking member of Armed Services at the time, and he was, working off of that playbook, but it took the vice president to make it happen because the department was against it. And I think the department, if asked, would have gone for a cyber force before space force, mostly because the space force was about 88% Air Force, maybe 92%, depending how you count it. About 5% Army and 2 or 3% the sea services. When you really look at the final light of the space force, so you're really just saying we're going to make this organization as inefficient, more efficient within itself, and I think and move small amounts over. The real savings comes in a cyber force where it's 30-30-30-10 across the services. And the reason I think you need it is the services are massively inconsistent. I agree completely. The U.S. Army is currently head and shoulders above with the exception of their stupid decision on the Army Cyber Institute in the last couple of weeks, moving it from being an independent organization. They have uniquely done the right thing again and again, the Army. They have built a service. And when I measured them in 2012, sitting in a COCOM, the Navy was the best, the Air Force was next, the Army was worse. By 2017, the Air Force had gotten up, the Navy had cratered, and the Army was moving up. And now in 2022, 2023, the Army's at the top of that heap. The Air Force is on a downslide and into a lower position. And this kind of inconsistency across services is killer. Because what you want when you're the force employer is a Mark 1 Mod 0 consistent. When I ask for a person with this level of seniority, this level of experience, out pops a woman or man of a grade, that's at least either enlisted or officer, by the way. That's different between every service, which is crazy wrong, that we can't even get that right. And that is, by the way, paid the same amount of money as the person next to him. So you need a consistent level of training and readiness and skill sets when you ask for something from the service. You need a consistent level of compensation, and that is batshit wrong right now inside. You can have 2 people sitting next to each other at Cyber Command, doing the same mission, in the same rank, compensated 30% differently. And then when one of them's an officer room is enlisted, you can really get a compensation differential across this. This is completely unacceptable. We don't accept this in any other part of the service. Our readiness at Cyber Command, who I agree is really the most important, he's the one combatant command in constant engagement with the adversary right now, every day out there. And he can't get his overall readiness up over years, despite what I think is exceptional leadership at the top of that organization and through that organization. And the reason is he's dealing with a product that somebody else produces. If I have a couple of things I'll say is, when you're recruiting for Cyberforce, you will be looking for a certain type of woman or man. When you're recruiting for the Air Force, Navy, and Army, you're looking for something slightly different. Let me just tell you who the recruiters get rewarded for. Delivering the mass base of 95% that are one type of thing. I guess I'll go one more thing. When I think about the Navy, or think about the Air Force, F-22 squadron, right? And it has 25 planes and 50 pilots. Those pilots are damn near interchangeable in that plane. That plane goes between like a 97 out of 100 to 103 out of 100, depending who the pilot is flying that plane. And cyber, that's completely 180'd out. When you bring a woman or man in, 17S in to do a mission or build a tool for you, the differential and there is no, infrastructure. There's some infrastructure, but it is the quality of the human almost uniquely in this. And that means you get these wide variances. And then when you have these wide variances measured across 4 services, you end up with a perpetually inconsistent, you don't know as someone transfers, is the person coming in behind them, am I going from C1 to C4 overnight? You don't have that problem in an F-22 squadron. When a pilot rotates and a new one comes in, you are C2 with a 788 rating, the next morning you're C2 with an 88 rating. That's not true in personnel. And that's why I think the cyber force is necessary to get that consistent level of training, readiness, compensation, and competency delivered to the force generator, the world's best, operational cyber warfighters at Cyber Command. I'm sorry, I went a little long.
George, please. No, thanks. Again, I feel a little underarmed here with two really smart Navy dudes. Although I did go to the Naval Board, so I'm in rigorous academic environment. But my first day of class was reading The Influence of Modern Sea Power, sitting on Gooseberry Beach with a cooler of beer. So that was the academic. It was tough. It is. So I will carry. So again, Mark, great. And I think what I would say is, it's not a matter of if we're going to have this discussion and whether we're going to debate having a sub. It's when and how we do it. So I would say, one, let's be careful of the timing when we do this and when we impose it. Again, we don't want to disrupt. The other thing I would say is for models. We all kind of have in our minds this Space Force model of what this thing should look like. And we all know, everybody in this room knows, cyber is inherently and completely a different domain than space. If you consider cyber, cyberspace, including DODN operations, cyber is embedded in the DNA down to the company, the ship. So you have to look at the problem differently. So as you think about comprising a force, you can't apply just the Space Force model. That's a model that applied to one domain in a unique environment. So what I would say is, in favor of intellectual discussion, is one, look at the National Security Agency Signals Enterprise model. Again, I am an Army signature. I'm not an expert, but I can tell you that from the Army term, we say space to mud. If you are a signature, there's a standard of training, whether you're an Army, a soldier, an airman, a sailor, whether you're at a strategic or tactical formation, there's a standard of training where when you get a signals intelligence soldier in at a base level, a joint soldier can conduct that task. So there's a model, all of the processes in place for enterprise architecture, for all of the things that allow NSA to be the world's best intelligence agency and enterprise that operates in the cyber domain. I would say that's a model we have to look at and determine what are those functions that a force would have to do that would take the best of what NSA does to take the human capital they have, which is civilians and sailors and airmen, and turn them into this singular focused enterprise. And that can sometimes be painful if you're trying to meet those standards, but we all know we have to meet them, and we know that the value of meeting them far offsets the cost of having to do that. That's one model. The other model I would say we've got to take a hard look at is the special operations model. Because I think the strength of what the special operations SOCOM model brings is understanding of different domains blended into a joint force. And we heard the senior enlisted panel this morning talk about their different experiences, and now they're at the joint level and how those, brought them together to be more effective. I think we've got, whatever we do, we've got to maintain this notion of you need both domain expertise and technical expertise. And as you learn how to defend a network as a lieutenant defending an Army network at the battalion level, those are the sorts of skills you need to know to defend a network at the strategic level later. So we've got to look at force composition and structure, and then ultimately determine what forces belong to the cyber force, if any. How does the Cyber National Mission Force fit in? Now that it's a sub-unified command, it's got a legitimate mission, it's really growing, and we really haven't given them a chance to take their training, fully exploit that sub-unit. What's their role? And so we've got to apply these different models as we look at a potential cyber force, wide open mind, intellectual, but look at all of the best models. We have the best special operating forces in the world. We have the best signals intelligence in the world. I would argue we have the best cyber force in the world. So what's the right combination to maximize that, exponentially and make it more efficient and better, quickly? Over.
Chris, can I jump in for a second? I want to violently agree that we should learn from the Space Force model. But I want to talk one thing about timing. You mentioned before, you mentioned again, I agree with that. And Mike Gallagher mentioned that earlier today. Now, remember this, I love Representative Gallagher. I've worked with him and for him for 5 years. His committee is supposed to look out to 2025. So he easily can say that year. I'm going to tell you right now, there's all kinds of investments going on that are moving. If you asked Admiral Davison today, is it 2027? He'd say, no, it's 2029 or 2030. We're moving that number to the right through all kinds of massive actions throughout the Joint Force and Congress and the Department of Defense. It's phenomenal. Thanks to to Ukraine, we have shifted things. Why does that matter? Because I think if we say, well, we'll wait till this next crisis is over where cyber's not under duress, we'll never get to the cyber force. So I would go now, get that. I hope there's no loss in the efficiency of there should not be a loss in the sufficiency of the force employer in this. But I'll say that if you're ever going to have that loss of efficiency, I'd have it in the next 2 years, not 4 years from now, 6 years from now, 8 years from now. And if I could say one other thing on the SOCOM model, I worry. Cybercom's had most of those same SOCOM authorities for 6 to 7 years. That's not the problem. They are still a kick-ass force employer. The problem is deeply in that fourth generation, which for the SOCOM people sits with the services. And the difference is when I'm a Navy SWO or aviator or submariner sitting in a room and a SEAL walks in and says, my budget needs to be 1.1 billion instead of 1 billion, we almost always just push the I believe yes button. We've looked at them as our combat arms brethren. When the cyber guy walks in and says, my budget needs to be 1.1 billion instead of 1 billion, we're like, who the hell gave him a billion? Now I know where that 100 billion I'm looking over is, right? It's just a different, I'm telling you, how that works among this. And I'm a convert now, but I'm in a very small group of converts on this. And I have to tell you, I just don't think the services, it's not that they don't value cyber, it's that they don't know how to value, and I mean value like in dollars, cyber, and therefore we don't give it the money it needs.
So I'm going to pivot. I'm going to kind of follow up on both the things you said. And the way I oversimplify, Mark, what you said is somebody has to come into work in the morning and say, this is why I come to work, right? It has to be like a competency, a reason why we exist. Two, the reason why I think the Army and to a lesser degree the Marines are doing this better is because, yeah, they are both invested in the individual. It's the soldier, it's the Marine that is the capability. They acknowledge that and those two services, unlike the Air Force and the Navy, that the capability is the platform or platform-centric services. This doesn't always necessarily focus around the individual. That is one of the problems. The SOCOM debate I love, and Mark, I'm really going to kind of follow up what you just said, is prior to the establishment of SOCOM, every service had a legitimate reason why they had some form of some special operations capability within their service. Nobody was arguing SEALs or Rangers or Delta or PJs or combat controllers. There was a reason for that. And then they said, hey, we need these organizations to work together. And, the SOCOM model was born to say how a Navy SEAL could work with a Ranger, could work with a PJ. And I think that's sort of when we created U.S. Cyber Command and we said, hey, we're going to do a SOCOM-like model, it was, hey, each service, create a cyber thing. And all these cyber things are going to look exactly the same. I mean, if you look at the training requirements for CMF to each of the services, there is no difference. It doesn't matter what uniform you show up in. You can be a member of a mission team or a CPT or whatever. There's no uniqueness that, let's say, the Navy or the Marines or the Army bring from service retained cyber operations that they've been doing that then get a little bit of joint spin put on top of them, and then they become part of a joint force. Last year, if you guys remember, when I gave a chant here, a rant maybe, it was more like it, very reminiscent to Mark's sort of talking points. And this is the demand signal that I throw back out to the community, which is one of the reasons why I think we're struggling. I will call it credibility. Now, everybody in this space does something in cyber, and we all acknowledge that we agree that we are a credible community. Well, I would argue when you get outside this community, you got to talk to a Ranger or a submarine driver or a pilot or a B-21 driver. They don't understand what it is that this community does. But there's probably nobody in this room that probably couldn't tell me what the force composition of a carrier strike group is. You're all aware of it. Even the Army guys, if I put the Army guys to a test, you could probably tell me what makes up a carrier strike group. You could probably take a Navy guy and tell him what makes up a brigade combat team. One of the things that we're struggling with in this space is when I coined them as the three questions, right? The first one is cyber warfighting domain, and everybody for the most part acknowledges that it is. But then the next question is, well, is our service, and I think this is where the Army is really shining, to be perfectly honest with you, is the service going to consider it a core competency in the way it's going to engage its adversaries? Is it going to professionalize around delivering effects in and through this space? And then the third one would be at the time, okay, well then how does your service take a leadership role in the environment to create the environment which we're going to fight in? That was sort of a head nod to the JICWA. Once again, the Air Force and the Army were both taking leadership positions in the creating of this environment. The Navy was sitting it out. So there was a time I was trying to drive the Navy. We could answer these three questions. Hey, it's an acknowledged warfighting domain. Hey, it's going to be a core competency for the way the Navy is going to present and deliver effects in and through the space. And then the Navy is going to take a leadership role in the creation of the JICWA to provide to the joint force. That's the way we had to get into this. But what always we kept falling back on is this idea of credibility. Do the other warfighting domains see this as credible as what they do? Firing an artillery piece, a tomahawk, a torpedo, an airstrike. There's still a sort of a chasm in between sort of what we say we can do and what we can actually demonstrate. And when we talk about the two sort of core missions, cybersecurity, say create a cyber service. Well, where the NC doc going to live? All right, look, every service is going to have a requirement to do cybersecurity. That's not going to get pulled out of the services if you create a cyber force. To protect their infrastructure, to include OT and weapon systems, everybody has to do that. I guess it's really when, to General Franz's point, when you get into sort of the operational or strategic levels of warfare, every service has some component of aviation. But the Air Force is long-range strike and air superiority. That's why we created the F-22 and the Joint Strike Fighter and the P-21s. That's why they exist in that service, because that's their core mission. I think one of the things the Army arguably is doing a very good job on is sort of demonstrating they are taking this into their DNA. It's part of their core, doctrinally, tactically, career-wise. All that stuff is very established. And I think what I would even argue, shy of a cyber service, I would probably be the first one that would look over at the Army and say, you should be the force provider for the strategic and the operational levels of warfare. Everybody's going to have a tactical thing they do. There's always going to be a requirement to train a cyber defender to do something on a piece of equipment or living in an SSP somewhere. But from the new maneuver warfare space, I think that's where we're debating what we're maybe been struggling on presenting.
One quick two-figure. I just want to double up on that and say that if we do a cyber force, the one thing I know, I don't know what you got the deck on what goes exactly there. I think I'm very close to you, Chris. I do know one thing. It's going to be the Secretary of Army and Cyber. And we're going to put it on the Army because, we've got a thoroughbred running right now, and we need to stay on that. And what I mean by that is the senior executives, who back up the career, back up the political appointees in the Department of Army are making the right decision time after time after time. And you want to bet on those horses again as you set up the cyber force. Because I do agree that we have to be insanely sensitive to any disruptions in the force employment. And to do that, I'd bet on the best show horse right now and get it in there. You call them colonels instead of cat. I don't care. Sure. The most important thing is to get it in there. And I think you're absolutely right. It's gone in their DNA, and it's probably because when the Army looks at a unit, it's a collection of people, individual warfighters. Same with the Marine Corps to some degree. When the Navy looks at a unit, a squadron, they don't say, "Oh, that's a squadron of 263 people." They say that's a squadron of 17 F-35s. Same with the Air Force.
Hey, very good. And hey, what we really want to do is open it up to some questions. So if we have a microphone that we can pass around for questions, I'm not sure where that is, but I'll give you just a couple of final thoughts. Where we cut the deck is going to be important. It's wonderful to hear that everybody thinks the Army is doing well. I'm a retired Army, although I also went to the Naval War College and learned about ladders and heads and stuff like that. So it was pretty fun. Hey, another thing, do we need more than one cyber force? Does the Department of Defense need one? And maybe the Department of Homeland Security, similar to the Coast Guard, to have that, first responder mission, to have all the law enforcement missions similar to the Coast Guard.
And while people are thinking of an answer, I just want to throw this one more thing out. For those of you who've read, I always use like this Moneyball analogy, right? Cyber, for all practical purposes, is a less expensive means and methods or form of warfare. I mean, the things we can do in this space are considerably less expensive than a Ford aircraft carrier. Where I sit mostly is watching how dollars move around the Pentagon and things we spend money on, right? So the Department of Defense's budget is X. The Department of the Navy's budget, I think in 25 is $260 billion. A large chunk of that, almost all of that, goes to the thing which I would argue are the core competencies of a Navy. Columbia-class submarine, carrier strike. We're doing a lot with unmanned vehicles now. I mean, that's sort of where we're making a lot of our investments. And when you start spending a lot of money on things that are very expensive, you get down to the bottom, there's not a lot of money to do these kind of things. This is why I kind of get back to this credibility argument. If this space was deemed a little more credible, the things cost, compared to an aircraft carrier, really next to nothing. It would be easy then to transition dollars into a space where now you're getting into this, the on-base percentage. You're not buying your marquee players. You're achieving end states. And I think that's one of the, I would criticize the Department of Defense to one degree or another. We're so enamored with things, we sometimes lose sight of what the end state is. The end state is achieving, deterring China from invading Taiwan. Do you do that purely with a forced presentation of ships that you don't want to fight, or are there other ways to engage the adversary in this space that would deter them from fighting?
Yeah, on answering, there's one for the Department of Defense, one for the Department of Homeland Security. We've thought of that already. The Department of Homeland Security has something called Hunt and Incident Response Teams. In theory, that should grow up. Congress took their budget from $8 million to $40 billion Unfortunately, that has not resulted in a 4 or 5-fold increase in their capability and capacity. I think it's been tucked into what's called the Joint Collaborative, the JCDC. So I'm hoping that over time we develop that, because we need that capacity to sit with Title 38, Title 22 forces. You know, we need the Coast Guard to be good at. They have a few, and most of you know the Coast Guard actually contributes to the National Mission Force as well, but they have some for domestic protection purposes. But the vast majority need to come out of DHS and those hunt and incident response teams. But that is shallow in its readiness.
We've got a question over here.
Hey, good afternoon. Question in kind of prodding on this proposition of the cyber force. If the department has declared cyber as a domain from 2004, how would you defend to a young operator why out of 5 domains, 4 of them are deserving of the service, but this one is not? How do you speak to that? And then sort of relatedly, if you look at the cyber enterprise, the service cyber component, cyber command, as well as the components within the services that operate in space, the general and flag officer corps, overwhelming majority, 85%, aren't cyber in background. How is that sensible? How does that make sense where you wouldn't put an intel officer in charge of a carrier? You wouldn't put a logistician in charge of the infantry battalion?
Yeah, again, so I'd kind of reverse that answer and say cyber, while we declared it a domain, cyber is uniquely different. Cyberspace operations occur I'll speak to the Army, in every level from platoon to company all the way through Army Service Component Command. And it's really how we ultimately make the value of what those soldiers do clear to them in terms of their role and function. You're a network operator, you are doing cyberspace operations. You are a network defender, you're doing cyberspace operations. You're doing electronic warfare blended. There's a number, so it's describing the role that they have as a soldier first, and then their specialty and how they contribute to the warfighting both in the domain, and again, cyber is at the DNA level across every domain. So again, my experience is not having to justify to a soldier why they don't have their own service. It is making them understand the importance of their mission. Again, we should be framing this whole discussion around joint all-domain operations. I've never been in combat without being in a joint environment, depending on the other services. So this is about creating the right joint force. And again, I think having cyberspace as a domain gives you a dimension and left-right limits, but it's not the end of the discussion. And again, we heard, I think there's a service culture that's important. And I think the technical skill of cyber is important. And I think the blend of those is what's made our force uniquely capable going forward. Again, I can't speak to let me answer kind of a question that came out here. Again, and I appreciate the kudos to the Army. I will tell you that was not an unpainful journey. The Army didn't get there without lots of work, really hard work. And I will say, but at the end of the day, what the Army did was we received the priorities from the Department of Defense. We had leaders that understood those priorities, combat arms officers, our field artillerymen, who then put processes in place to respond to the requirements that they were directed to respond to by the department. Going forward, that's not going to, whether we have a force or not, whoever ultimately is responsible has to receive the direction from Congress, from the department. The department has got to enforce all of the standards and policies that they put in place, regardless of what organization. And so the service cultures are not going to change overnight because we create a force. In fact, now they'll have an easier target. What I would say is discipline, focus. And again, the question you got to ask yourself is creating another administrative formation really the answer to solving a problem when we've got 8 new authorities going to an existing command? We haven't given them a chance to operate there. So let's resource that command. I don't have any problem with CyberCon being a force generator as long as they're properly resourced to do it. And most of the authorities, the things that they have just received, they've had operational authorities for a long time. The unsexy authorities that they have just received, budget authority, acquisition authority for JECWA, training, those are things the command has not had and frankly doesn't have until we start FY24. So to say they've had the authorities, they've had a lot of operational authorities and have done great. They have not had those force generation authorities that allow them to do the job. And I would argue that's going to happen starting in FY24. We're not going to stop that and start to look at a cyber force at the expense of continuing the momentum that we have in DoD and in the command now. There's no way we can do that. So the question is timing, and is that really the answer? I don't want us to be a solution seeking a problem. If we have solved 75% of the issues, let's figure out what that 25% is we need to solve and figure out the right way to solve it.
I guess I take umbrage with the idea that we've solved 75% of the issues. I think we're way below that number, especially in the non-force employment world. And even then, the first 7 years of Cyber Command was a struggle because the rest of the government, and including elements of the Department of Defense, stopped cyber from, the military from doing cyber surveillance and reconnaissance as a traditional military activity. So, I mean, I have to be honest, I do not trust, if the answer is, why create an administrative system? Let the system work. The system is not functioning. And I don't like the idea like these acquisition authorities at Cyber Command that are going along, the services aren't going to give the money to them. They're not going to give up their tool generation money willingly. And I just think that this is, we're trying too hard to have 4 answers to one question. The one answer is a unified cyber force. I think you said it right in your opening remarks that we know we're going to do it at some point. The question is the timing right now. And I'd say the timing's never been better. This is the time to do it when we're, 3-4 years away from combat, or 6-8 years away from combat with a truly cyber enabled adversary. Not after that's over and we're kind of part of the part of the forensics on how this goes so crappy, was that we didn't have a unified cyber force, and we didn't have the level of readiness. And again, as much as I love even Paul Nakasone, who is by far, I've known him personally for years and worked with him. He's by far the most energetic and thoughtful leader on cyber I've come across. He could not be force generator, force employer, and dual-headed. That will not work. It won't work for any successor. We need to put that force generation in a separate command with full support from a single secretariat that demands adherence to the proper standards. And as I said, right now, the obvious candidate is the Secretary of the Army with a cyber force commander, with a cyber force and with a 3 or 4 star leading that, and then a cyber command with a 4 star leading that. And he should be dual-headed for the foreseeable future.
Oh, we got another question up there.
Hello, my name. You gotta push the green button and wait till it turns green. Yeah, my name's Chief Robertson. I'm with the CT 169, and I've been in the cyber business now for a while, and I've seen this as a problem: is talent management within the services. I would like to hear your opinion on if we create a separate cyber force, will we be able to manage talent, the talent within the structure, the rank structure, with a separate force versus their traditional, Army.
This to me is one of the biggest strengths of an independent cyber force. First, you can manage the money. We can align the MOSs or NECs, depending which terminology we end up using, to technology, much like NSA does. And based on those technologies, provide proficiency pay, SSTAP, AIP, retention bonuses, whatever it is. You can do this by those skill sets. You can manage this. I'll give you a great example. McCain saw this problem 5 years ago, directed us to do language to let each service allow commission or bring in enlisted people at the E5, E6, E7, or O2, 3, 4 levels in order from the private sector. In the first 2 years of it, services, that, and in cyber, it was uniquely for cyber. It mirrors something we do for doctors, and at least in the Navy, probably the other services. It's a great idea, right? It allows people to take talent from the private sector that can come in and make a real difference in cyber. You wouldn't do this for F-22 pilots. You're not like, man, that dude flew the 737 well. Come fly my F-22. But in cyber, you could see this skill set come over. And initially, first 2 years, no takers, no service to anything. Then the Army got kicked a little bit because the Army cared more at that time than everybody else. I think they're up to 8 or 10 people now they've hired this. The other services aren't doing it.
Air Force has been doing this for 3 years.
How many people do you think you have?
They're in the double digits.
So 11? I mean, the limit was
That's 20 officers we didn't have.
the limit was 200.
Yeah, but the Army's nowhere near that either.
I know, but okay, I'll agree with you that all the services suck at it. Because after 5 years, what we said was come back to us and tell us the new number that ought to be a higher number. And you sound like we're 10 or 12%, but I believe that number. And I'll take it that the Navy's going to be lower than the Air Force and Army. My point on this is, that's a fantastic idea about how you do talent management. It's not gonna be executed by the services that aren't cyber specific like this. But again, I get back to the pay, retention, it's gotta be standardized across skill sets and performance levels that we can't get with the individual, with four, now five individual services.
Yeah, Chief, I will tell you, really, ultimately, you can define how do you define what the cyber force is? As you're a warrant officer, you start that out as a private, you grew into a warrant officer, and there's a career path from you that takes you from private to as far as you want to go. And I would say, one, cyberspace involves DOT operations, security, defensive cyber offense, and command and control. So the question is, if you define what a cyber force is, we know that there are significant cyber forces that are going to remain in each of the services. They're going to have to do that. Are you going to try to create a separate joint cyber force that doesn't pull from all and allow for that cross-fertilization of joint assignments? Again, as a signature, I was able to go from Army assignments to joint assignments to intelligence agency assignments, and there was a career path that allowed me to grow from a lieutenant, to a 2-star. That path exists in all of the services now for cyber, and some it's better than others. And again, we heard the chiefs and senior officers here this morning say it's getting better. I would submit there's ways to standardize that with both authority. It's going to be a policy that standardizes it. Whether that policy applies to a cyber force or applies to the department, I think better policy and better enforcement of standards across the services would get you, moving along that path a lot better. We know there has been progress there. And again, if you look at the authorities that have just been granted U.S. Cybercom for joint training standards, for those things that are ultimately going to enable that, I think there's multiple ways to get there. I would submit cyber service is not the only way. I think there's other models that would get you there and also maintain that good jointness from tactical to strategic that you need to be a viable.
And I think we're about out of time for our panel, but this was interesting. I hope everybody found it valuable. So thank you very much for participating.